a deep dive into the world of psychedelics, hosted by Brooker. You're with Friends in High Places.
So, hi Chris, and welcome to Friends in High Places.
Hi Ben, thanks for having me.
Cool, it's good to have you on. So for people who don't know, you're a philosopher of mind and cognitive science. You're a lecturer at the University of Western Australia and a postdoc at the University of Adelaide, I believe.
Yeah, for at least another 2 months or so. That's about to come to an end, but for now I am, yeah.
Cool. Is there anything else that kind of people should know about, I guess, what you do and what your background is in academia?
Well, not really. So, I mean, that is my primary training, philosophy of mind and cognitive science. And since the start of my PhD research, which is 9 years ago now, I've been focusing on issues in that broad area, philosophy of mind and cognitive science, relating to the use of psychedelics in neuroscience and psychiatry, which of course is what we're going to be talking about. So the only other thing perhaps is that I did all my schooling at the University of Adelaide, which is a pretty unusual thing. You know, often people will go elsewhere for their master's or PhD, but I did all my degrees, bachelor's, master's and PhD at the University of Adelaide before moving to Perth for my current job at UWA. And then shortly after that, I got this postdoc position at Adelaide, which I do mostly remotely from here. So, yeah.
Right. Well, our paths kind of interestingly kind of reflect each other in that sense, because I've spent most of my time sort of between WA, where I kind of spent some of my childhood, and Adelaide now, and you've done the reverse. So that's a bit of interesting synergy.
Yeah, indeed. This is probably a controversial question, but do you have a favorite out of the two cities?
Oh, look, I don't know Perth well enough these days. So I would have to say Adelaide, somewhat shamefacedly. Quite something to put out any kind of a book in the middle of a pandemic. I know a lot of authors who've had interesting experiences around that. But yours is particularly of interest to me. It's called Philosophy of Psychedelics, published by Oxford University Press. And it seems to me to be perhaps a unique kind of entry in the field of psychedelic literature, of which there's an increasing amount these days. We've kind of been in the thick of what's been called the psychedelic renaissance for, I suppose, 15 or perhaps 20 years now. And correct me if I'm wrong, but your book does seem to me to be perhaps the first kind of comprehensive attempt in a way to reconcile psychedelic experience with Western philosophy and particularly materialism, which is kind of the central tension, I would say, in your book. So perhaps let's just start there. How do you define materialism as a philosopher? And what is the tension or the apparent tension between, I guess, that perspective and the psychedelic experience as you understand it?
Sure, yeah. So there are a few different words that kind of denote closely related views in philosophy: materialism, physicalism, naturalism, and they tend to, denote views like everything that exists is natural. The natural world is all there is one way people define naturalism, or everything is material, or everything is physical. And obviously, if you espouse a position like this, you immediately run into questions like, what does it mean for something to be physical or to be material? And this is problematic in a number of ways, because physical science is incomplete, and the sort of notions of matter that we've traditionally associated with that word are a bit outdated according to the perspective of current physics. So the way I define it is, in a way, a negative claim. It's just to say that there is no mind or consciousness at the foundation of reality, right? So to put the position positively rather than as a negative thesis, it's the idea that mind or consciousness are things that evolve, that develop or emerge, and they're ultimately built out of some kind of fundamental stuff or processes or substrate or whatever, something fundamental that is non-minded, that is non-conscious. So it's the idea that mind, meaning, conscious experience, purpose, all these things somehow develop in the same way that we know that life, or organic matter and organic processes develop. And the tension there, of course, is that very often in psychedelic experiences, especially sort of overwhelming kind of positive transformative experiences of the kind that people have in therapeutic settings, there seems to be this apprehension of something that is in tension with that kind of materialist view, whether it be, you know, sometimes it's the idea that mind or consciousness is ubiquitous, that, you know, there is a universal consciousness or a cosmic consciousness underlying all of existence, or in some cases it might be the existence of a spirit world or a spirit realm or an afterlife or something like that. But in any case, some apparent experience of mind or consciousness that doesn't depend on a fundamental non-minded, non-conscious physical substrate. And so people seem to have these experiences of realities that often seem to them to be very real, that fly in the face of this kind of physicalist, materialist or naturalist worldview. And so then you have a number of choices, a number of options open to you in terms of what you decide to think about all this. You know, do you kind of retain a materialist worldview and reject these experiences as hallucinatory, or do you accept the experiences are veridical in some sense and then reject materialism, embrace some other philosophical view of the universe? Or do you, and this is putting it sort of fairly crudely, this is the approach I try and take, do you to some extent try and dissolve the tension between the materialist worldview and the psychedelic experience and show that they can actually be reconciled? And I mean, to give a spoiler, I don't think they can completely, but I think they can to a surprising extent. I think there's a surprising amount of what goes on in psychedelic experiences, and particularly in therapeutic and transformative psychedelic experiences, that isn't actually incompatible with a philosophical naturalist or materialist outlook.
And I think, you know, many people who have had experience of psychedelics or kind of move within these circles would have an intuition around that tension you're talking about, because, as you know, there's a very kind of long and storied kind of school in a way of psychedelic literature. I'm thinking of people like the McKennas, both Dennis and Terence, whose writings attest to a certain view of psychedelics, which is that they do open up doorways to other realms, other realities, which really do exist out there somewhere in their view. So I'm wondering, you know, where does your approach sit in relation to that? And I sort of asked that question as someone who, I must admit that I have some sympathy with that view, to the extent, at least, that you know, in the book that I'm writing on psychedelics, my approach has been one of skepticism, but skepticism in the sense of being open-minded about these questions rather than cynical about them. I don't know if you've read a book, for example, like I was thinking of Eric Davis's High Weirdness, which is a wonderful book about kind of psychedelic culture in the 1970s. And there's something incredibly appealing to me about embracing this kind of sense that psychedelics are incredibly strange tools for not just achieving altered states of consciousness, but for accessing other realms of really existing reality. So yes, you know, how do you approach that from the position of you know, a naturalist or physicalist or materialist philosopher?
Sure. So, I mean, I should say, I think there's something incredibly appealing about that whole view as well. I mean, I wish it were true. I really would love it to be the case that psychedelics do provide us with access to some kind of transcendent realm beyond the material, beyond the physical. And in my younger days, I used to believe in such things. You know, I wasn't always a materialist, but the sort of quick and dirty take, the basic point I think to make about this idea is that if this were true, you know, there have been so many kind of millions of psychedelic experiences that humans have had in history, you know, even in recent decades. And you would expect at some point, if people really were tapping into objectively existing sort of non-physical realms, that someone would have, you know, by sheer accident stumbled on some kind of objectively verifiable evidence of that. You know, I mean, by the nature of the thing, it's very hard to, but surely somebody somewhere would have had a precognitive vision of next week's, you know, winning lottery numbers. Or there's a great blog post about this actually, which explores a lot of these issues and tensions by a guy called Scott Alexander, and it's about, you know, taking DMT and seeing the kind of entities, you know, the apparent sort of non-human, disembodied, discarnate entities, people sometimes call them.
The self-transforming machine elves.
Well, yeah, that's one species, if you like, McKenna's machine elves. Yep. It's a giant green bat in this blog post, I think. But in any case, you know, people meet all sorts of weird and wonderful entities on DMT. And this blog post is a fictional story about someone trying to address exactly the challenge that I'm raising, trying to get these DMT entities to do some kind of fiendishly complex mathematical equation or problem, so that they couldn't possibly have done themselves, so they can bring back objective evidence that you know, that there really are disembodied intelligences. And of course the DMT entities in the story are these spiritual entities that won't have a bar of that say you're missing the point. It's all about enlightenment and universal love and so on. And maybe that's right, but I mean, the sheer variety of things that people seem to encounter and types of realms and types of entities they seem to encounter, you would think that some kind of signal would have to have emerged in terms of people accessing some kind of paranormal, you know, information or you know, precognitive information or something like that. So that's kind of the basic point, is that, you know, there doesn't seem to be strong objective evidence that people really are accessing other realms or other dimensions, rather than just having extremely vivid and compelling hallucinations. And then there are just sort of general philosophical reasons for preferring materialism over other philosophies of mind, I think, like dualism, which says that mind and body are two separate things, crudely, or the various versions of idealism or panpsychism, which say that consciousness is somehow everywhere in the universe, it's ubiquitous. I think the arguments favor materialism, and in particular, there are certain materialist ideas about consciousness and what it is and how it works and how it relates to brain activity that are very popular in neuroscience at the moment, that I think if you embrace them, you can see from a materialist perspective why and how there could be drugs that would induce these kinds of experiences, you know, because this is the main thing. I think, you know, when people have these sorts of experiences and become persuaded that there really are other realms or other realities out there, part of it maybe is just taking the experience at face value. That's what I seem to experience, so I believe that's what I did experience. But I think another part of it is just this incredulity that a materialist or naturalist view could explain this sort of thing. It's like, how can you, from a naturalist perspective, possibly explain the sorts of things that happen to people on psychedelics? And we certainly don't have a complete theory yet that can explain why this person saw a self-transforming machine elf and this person saw a great green bat talking about universal love. But I think in sort of principle, in broad outline, we have some good ideas about what conscious experience is and how it relates to brain activity that let you start to see why and how, given naturalism, the human brain, the human mind would be capable of and susceptible to these sorts of experiences if you kind of manipulate it in the right way.
Just kind of thinking as a psychonaut might be thinking, sitting here now listening to you talk, I feel like one of the objections they might raise to what you've just said is that there is, or at least appears to be, quite strong commonalities across various people's experiences of certain substances, DMT that we've already mentioned, particularly. And so people will you know, describe extremely similar experiences under the effect of potent hallucinogens like DMT, and point to that as evidence that you know, shows or proves that there is some other existing reality that these substances are providing access to. The other idea that I think is at play here is this notion of a collective unconscious, that somehow psychedelics are tapping into this unconsciousness that we all share. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think a suitably kind of tamed version of a collective unconscious might be compatible with naturalism or materialism, but it wouldn't be a genuinely collective unconscious. Basically, if you've got these kinds of things, if you've got cross-personal commonalities, you know, and cross-cultural commonalities in the kinds of experiences people are having, there are two ways you can explain it. Either there is some real reality that they're all experiencing, or there's something in common between their brains. You know, there's some common feature that their brains have that is causing them to have these sorts of experiences. And obviously that's the sort of explanation a naturalist has to favor, is it's not because we're encountering the same real things, but it's because we're wired in the same way, and so we're susceptible to the same kinds of hallucinations. And I think, you know, the more kind of striking and specific these apparent commonalities get, the more that sort of explanation stretches credulity or kind of starts to seem a bit unbelievable. But the other thing is, we don't really know yet to what extent there are these cross-cultural commonalities in ways that can't be accounted for more prosaically, right? So, I mean, that's the third possible explanation when you've got these sorts of commonalities in the experience, is there are memes afloat on the culture. You know, people have been exposed to the same ideas about what sorts of experiences you have on these substances, and that's why they're having the same experiences. And so my bet is that, you know, so the point is that first off, we need to establish rigorously, you know, rather from my perspective, rather than merely anecdotally, exactly what sorts of commonalities there are. You know, I mean, Benny Shannon, who's a psychologist, Israeli cognitive scientist with a philosophical background as well, he kind of says there are these really specific commonalities on the level of content. You know, I think he says people who take ayahuasca, he interviewed, you know, a couple of hundred people who drank ayahuasca, and, you know, I think it was like he asked them all, did you see cheetahs? And they all said, no, I saw pumas, or something like this, something really specific, you know. But yeah,
also the case with salvia, I think there's very often reports of a kind of female appearing deity or angel-like creature, again, which seems kind of cross-cultural and cross-temporal. So, you know, it does raise intriguing questions for us.
Yeah, it does. It certainly does. But, you know, I think McKenna's machine elves, which you mentioned earlier, are a good case in point, right? So sometimes people say, oh, well, when people smoke DMT and they see machine elves, it's because they've listened to too many Terence McKenna talks. But if you go back, you can find reports before Terence McKenna of people talking not about, you know, jeweled self-dribbling basketballs or self-transforming machine elves, but talking about little creatures, you know, little men or tykes or pixies or whatever under the influence of DMT. Well, so, okay, so all you need really to explain that is to suggest that cross-culturally people's brains have the ability to mentally represent small people or small entities or small creatures, and that somehow DMT, because of the way the brain is wired up, and we need to remember the fiendish complexity of the brain and, you know, how little we understand to date about the specificities of its working. But all you need in principle is the idea that, yeah, brains across cultures have the capacity to represent small people or small humanoid entities, and that then, you know, the particular cultural sort of upbringing that a given person has puts flesh on those bones, you know, and then the details turn out to be a bit different, but somehow the pathways it's hitting frequently tend to stimulate that particular cross-culturally available form of representational content, to put it in the philosophical jargon. So yeah, so that's the general idea, is that if the naturalist or materialist account is true, which I think it's going to turn out to be, then it will have to be true that all the sort of interpersonal and cross-cultural commonalities in the contents of psychedelic experience can be accounted for either in terms of ideas that people absorb from each other and from the culture, or in terms of, you know, capacities that our brains all share because we have the same fundamental evolutionary heritage. We have the same basic kind of neural wiring, even though the details get filled in differently by culture.
Mm. And I have to say as well, I think it feels a little glib to me to dismiss cultural specificity so easily when we talk about these sorts of issues. For example, I know Douglas Rushkoff has talked about this really interestingly. where he kind of pointed out that, you know, a lot of people in the last, say, 2 or 3 decades have reported psychedelic experiences that involve like heavily pixelated or computer game type imagery, whereas he kind of contrasts that with in, say, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because radio was a new medium, the way that clairvoyance and, you know, so-called mediums kind of hooked into this idea of kind of like voices in the air. So again, there's a, you know, there's a kind of cultural specificity at play with those things. So I think when we say that, you know, there are no cultural influences in the way that people experience these drugs, I think we can too easily dismiss evidence like that.
Absolutely. And I don't think anyone should think it's plausible that psychedelic experiences are entirely unaffected by culture. I think everyone who's intellectually honest has to agree, because I mean, you know, you can have a psychedelic trip and literally have visions of the TV show you've just been watching or the novel you've just been reading or something like that. So obviously they are to some extent affected by culture. The question is how much, to what extent. I agree with people who kind of opt for a non-naturalist interpretation that there are significant chunks of them that aren't affected by culture, but then my materialist bet is that all the bits that can't be accounted for in terms of culture can be accounted for in terms of nature, in terms of, yeah, innate sort of evolutionary heritage of our minds. Yeah.
So I'm curious as to where you see the new neuroscience around psychedelics fitting into the picture that you're drawing for us, because particularly through magnetic resonance imaging technology, we're now getting interesting looks at the brain on psychedelics. And, you know, people are probably familiar with, you know, these images of, you know, you have a, you know, a kind of a brain on one side and the brain on the other side that's on psilocybin, and, you know, all these areas are lit up, and, you know, there's this kind of view that tells us a lot about the way that different networks in the brain might be being activated or suddenly in communion with each other under the influence of psychedelics where they weren't before. So I wonder, for the sort of for the naturalist perspective that you're bringing to psychedelics, where does the picture that contemporary neuroscience is painting of psychedelics fit?
Yeah, so I mean, in my book, the main sort of framing device, if you like, the main issue that I'm trying to address is, look, what should a naturalist or a materialist think about all this? You know, we have this kind of, because it's all kind of prompted by this consistent finding that you get in clinical trials of psychedelics, that positive outcomes, that reductions in psychiatric symptoms seem to be correlated with the occurrence of a specific type of experience, the so-called mystical type experience, while people are on the drug. It's sort of like not a strict linear function of dose. It seems like the people who, when they fill out the psychometric questionnaires, the people who satisfy the definition of a complete mystical type experience are the ones who have lasting reductions in anxiety, depression, symptoms of substance abuse, and so on. And the ones who don't satisfy those criteria don't tend to have such beneficial outcomes. So it looks like this is part of how it works, you know, by inducing, in certain cases, a mystical type experience, which is defined in terms of, you know, feelings of unity and transcendence of time and space, this noetic quality, feeling of gaining direct knowledge of reality, and so on. And so the basic thought is, if you think the evidence and arguments for a worldview like materialism are pretty good, and you have a sort of first glance look at what's going on in psychedelic therapy, in clinical research, you might be reasonably concerned. You might sort of wonder, as Michael Pollan did in his article in the New Yorker, you know, is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying? Are we giving people with various psychiatric maladies these powerful drugs that are making them have effectively metaphysical hallucinations, in the phrase that one philosopher uses, and that those metaphysical hallucinations of a great beyond, of a cosmic consciousness or a spirit world or whatever, are then bringing about lasting improvements in mood and improvements in mental health? So that's the question for a naturalist. You know, is that really what's going on? And if so, is that something we should be worried about? And what I try and show in the book, I try and sort of bring together this multidisciplinary argument, sort of using tools from philosophy, but also using data from neuroscience and psychopharmacology and so on, to weave it all together into this argument that essentially that's not what's really going on. That's an oversimplistic and misleading picture of what really happens in psychedelic therapy. And in particular, I try and show that it's just not true that everyone who's having a transformative, therapeutically beneficial psychedelic experience is really having some kind of metaphysical vision of a cosmic consciousness or a spirit world or something like that. So it turns out that if you look more closely, if you look at actual qualitative interviews with the patients themselves, you find that this construct, this operational construct of a mystical type experience actually casts a pretty broad net, you know, and there are people ticking those psychometric boxes, if you like, satisfying those criteria, who are having metaphysical visions of a universal consciousness or a spirit world. But then there are people ticking those boxes who are having experiences of feeling profoundly connected to everything and everyone, and feeling kind of wonder and awe at the grandeur and mystery of the universe, and having psychological insights, seeing their own life from a new, broader perspective from the outside, getting kind of a new perspective on their problems, having emotional breakthroughs, feelings of catharsis. So it seems like whatever sort of factor it is that this construct of the mystical type experience is latching onto, it can't be these changes in metaphysical beliefs about the nature of reality, because you don't actually get those every time you get the definition of the mystical type experience being satisfied. So then to really make good on that, to make the story complete, I have to kind of say something positive. So what is it? If it's not changes in metaphysical beliefs about the nature of reality, what is it really that's driving this therapeutic process of change? And that's the main place where the neuroscience comes in for me, because I've sort of arrived at this conclusion that the real active ingredient, if you like, psychologically, therapeutically speaking, is not changes in metaphysical beliefs. So what is it? So then I kind of draw on evidence from these neuroimaging studies, and also from other psychological studies where people fill in psychometric questionnaires and so on. And I argue for this idea that what is really doing the work, what is really bringing about the therapeutic change, is that people's mental representations of the self, their kind of conception of who they are, their self-representation, as it's called in philosophy and neuroscience and psychology, is being disintegrated and then kind of reconstructed after the experience. And it's plugged into this broader story that, you know, a common feature of these various pathologies is kind of some negative form of self-representation that can be very rigidly entrenched and hard to shake, hard to get out of or change. And so then what psychedelics do, fundamentally, they do a lot of things, but the main consistent therapeutic effect that they have is to kind of dissolve your sense of who you are, that's kind of been structuring and constraining and shaping your whole experience of life and the world. And they give you a chance to actually revise that, to reframe your sense of who you are and develop a new sort of healthier, more flexible sense of self. And so one source of evidence I appeal to is, yeah, the sorts of neuroimaging studies you talk about. I mean, it's worth mentioning that psychedelic neuroimaging is actually a very difficult, very kind of controversial field, because there are so many variables at play, and there are a lot of findings, a lot of specific findings fail to replicate. But if you take a sort of broad brush look, one of the things that seems to be consistent is there are these two systems in the brain, the default mode network and the salience network, and both of them have a large body of evidence that's got nothing to do with psychedelics, saying that they're involved in self-representation. These networks, among their other functions, seem to be involved in constructing and maintaining our psychological sense of self, our sense of who we are. And you find that consistently in the psychedelic experience and in the process of psychedelic therapy, the activity and the connectivity of these particular networks seems to get changed. They seem to get disintegrated and reintegrated and this kind of thing. So for me, that's kind of one more piece of evidence, one more strike for the view that it's changes to self-representation or to the sense of self that are really doing the work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people that you mentioned in the book is Roland Griffiths, who of course is, you know, by now a kind of legend in kind of psychedelic studies. And, you know, it was one of his papers that I think was really foundational in terms of the psychedelic renaissance, the one around mystical type experience, where, you know, basically that paper found that, you know, as you were saying, the therapeutic utility of psychedelic experiences seems to turn more on ego dissolution, which is what you were just talking about, than changes in metaphysical beliefs about the world around us.
So I'm not sure. Are you talking about Griffith's paper from 2006, the famous one, psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences? Yeah, so I mean, I haven't read it in a while. As far as I know, they didn't actually assess in that whether metaphysical beliefs change. I mean, I was involved in a study recently with some researchers from Imperial College London where we tried to look at that systematically. My recollection, I think they might have looked at a couple of things that, you know, were perhaps connected to metaphysical belief. But as I recall, the main finding of that Griffiths paper from 2006 was just that, yeah, it is the mystical type experience. It's this construct of the mystical type experience that seems to mediate positive outcomes and seems to lead people to evaluate the experience as being, you know, among the sort of top 5 most meaningful and significant of their life and that kind of thing. Yeah, right. I think this attempt to actually sort of get more precise and fine-grained about what is that construct of a mystical type experience really latching onto, and how does it relate to other things like ego dissolution, metaphysical belief change, psychological insight, emotional breakthrough. I think that's been a pretty recent development really in the last sort of 3 to 5 years, that people have started to get more interested in really trying to tease out the different factors and processes that might be involved on a psychological level.
Right. I thought, having won my first year undergrad philosophy prize, Chris, I'd be well placed to this conversation, not being a philosopher myself. But I confess there was one concept that did kind of get away from me in the book, and I bring it up because you were just talking about beliefs. But there's this other notion that was not familiar to me that you introduced, which is the idea of Aleafs, which is a concept that you kind of contrast with beliefs. In your words, can you explain what an Aleaf is? Because my layman's understanding was that it's something that people don't believe on a fundamental level, but is nevertheless forms kind of part of their background view of the world. Is that a fair kind of layman's description?
Yeah, that's not bad. That's in the ballpark. Although you could, another way of putting it would be that it's something that you sort of kind of believe on a more fundamental level. It's like in the conscious,
but it's kind of it disappears to you in a way that you're not conscious of it.
Yeah, something like that. Or at least, you know, you don't rationally think it's true. The conscious rationing, reasoning, deliberating part of your mind will say, no, I don't believe that. That's false, or I have no opinion on that. But then you can tell that some part of you sort of believes it, or some part of you thinks it's true or imagines it's true or something, because you feel as though it's true and you act as though it's true. And so, yeah, the classic example is somebody walking out onto a transparent balcony and they can see the kind of plummeting perilous drop below them, you know, and they could know as well as you like that this is perfectly safe. You know, they could be an engineer who's you know, supervised the construction and knows that this is the absolute safest balcony in the world. And so their belief will be that I am safe. I am not at significant risk of falling to my death. But then they may very well still be shaking and sweating and kind of inching their way out. And the idea is, well, that only makes sense if there's some part of them that kind of thinks that they are unsafe, that they are at serious risk of falling to their death, even if the rational part of them doesn't believe it. So that's the idea of an Aleaf, is, yeah, it's kind of a mental representation in the jargon. You've got some representation, some complex of thoughts and images or whatever of how the world is, a mental depiction of the world being a certain way. And even though you don't reflectively endorse it, you don't kind of on balance think, yes, that's an accurate representation, nonetheless it doesn't go away. It's still there, and it still influences your thoughts and your emotions and your behavior in the same ways that beliefs typically do.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, because you're a philosopher and I know you love thought experiments, there's another one that I wanted to bring up with you, which is kind of one of my favorites from the book, because this is an area of particular interest to me, is Mary's Room, which I think has a kind of long history in philosophy. And just correct me if I get this wrong, but essentially the thought experiment is that there's a neuroscientist called Mary who understands everything about the world and has knowledge about a kind of complete set of knowledges about everything. But she's never, but she's been kept in a kind of colorless monochromatic room all her life. And so she knows what red is in an abstract sense, but she's never actually seen it before. And so I guess the thought experiment runs from there as kind of, what happens if, she leaves that room and encounters red, and in what way is that kind of experiential knowledge different to what she knew before? Is that an accurate summation?
Yeah, that's essentially it. She doesn't need to know everything. Usually the emphasis is just that she knows the entirety of neuroscience. At some point in the future when neuroscience is complete, we know everything there is to know about the physiology and the anatomy of the brain. And so Mary in particular knows absolutely everything there is to know in neuroscience and physics and whatever about what happens when someone sees red. So that's the essential point you need to contrast, as you say, the sort of knowledge that she had of red experience before her release, and then the seemingly new kind of knowledge that she has of it afterwards. So yeah, that's the pivotal question, is what kind of knowledge, if any, does she gain when she leaves the room and sees something red for the first time? And yeah, in its original incarnation, Frank Jackson, an Australian philosopher, uses it as the basis for an argument against physicalism. He thinks that, the sort of new knowledge that basically he thinks that if physicalism is true, then Mary should have known everything while she was still in her room. But he thinks the thought experiment shows clearly that she didn't know everything. There was still something new for her to learn. And therefore physicalism has to be false. And so, yeah, and then many words have been written by philosophers in the 40 odd years since that argument was first appeared, trying to figure out what the correct thing is to say about it, and whether in fact it, most philosophers, I think, who have written about it think that it doesn't refute physicalism. But the question is, well, why not? What's the correct thing for a physicalist to say about what is actually going on there? And whether Mary acquires new knowledge or not, what kind it is, and why she couldn't acquire it from inside the room, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
So to kind of map this on to the psychedelic question, I mean, I think you take this idea of kind of knowledge acquisition in many interesting directions in the book. But I think one question that it obviously raises is, how do we talk about psychedelic experiences that people have, which are quite common, of, say, universal love, or a kind of a unitive sense of oneness with the cosmos? These these might be ideas that people have in a kind of abstract sense, but acquire a new kind of resonance and salience within psychedelic experiences. Suddenly the sense that, say, universal love, or that everything is connected, suddenly these ideas cease to feel like cliches. And this is quite an old idea. I actually came across it recently in the work of the Shulgins, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the kind of legendary pharmacologists. And in one of their books on tryptamines, they kind of discuss this exact idea that psychedelics can make truisms suddenly feel fresh and real and lived in a wholly new way. And with your indulgence, I can kind of illustrate this with an example from one of my own kind of psychedelic experiences under the influence of psilocybin. And basically kind of midway through this trip, I realized I kind of hadn't eaten for 3 or 4 hours because the mushrooms had made me quite nauseated. And I felt like I should. And so what I had to hand was some protein balls. And I tried to eat them, tried to kind of keep them down, and it was a genuine struggle. And I kind of stopped and I thought, okay, why isn't this working? What am I doing wrong? I need to eat something. And so I've found myself slowing down and taking smaller mouthfuls and chewing slowly, almost kind of in the manner of a Buddhist, like incredibly mindfully. And I found myself feeling less sick as I was doing this. And suddenly this kind of bloomed into this insight about kind of overconsumption and how the pace of kind of 21st century life is too fast, and it's destructive, and it's making us feel ill. And I know that people listening and listening to and watching this will think that that is not a particularly staggering insight. And in fact, it's something that most people would fairly blithely agree with and not feel is particularly significant or revelatory. But I can attest that under the influence of psilocybin, that felt like a genuine revelation. It felt like an epiphany. And actually, I did carry it over into the rest of my life, because over the next few weeks during that kind of afterglow period, I found myself thinking about my own consumption, and I sort of gave up caffeine for a while. And, you know, so I think there is something incredibly salient about these experiences. And I think it sheds a very interesting light on the nature of knowledge, as you discuss at length in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thanks for sharing. That's a great example, and that really, as you say, it is a very common type of experience that people have, and the particular content or the particular idea that one comes to know or understand or grasp in this deeper way, on this deeper level, can vary quite a lot. There are some common themes you get, and one of them, of course, is connectedness, you know, really feeling one's interconnectedness with other people, with nature, and this kind of thing, which one might have assented to before intellectually. And so it's interesting, coming off the back of our discussion about beliefs and Aleafs, because to bring out the notion of Aleafs, we were talking about situations where you have the mental representation, the kind of mental representation that influences your emotion and your behavior and so on, but you don't have the intellectual acceptance that this is really accurate. But of course, it can go the other way too. You can have cases where you have the intellectual acceptance that something is accurate, that some proposition is true, but you don't have the kind of knowledge of it, the kind of mental representation of it that really influences how you feel and how you emote and how you act and so on. And that's one thing that psychedelics seem to be able to do, is to close the gap, to take these kind of merely intellectual, merely reflective beliefs and turn them into something full-bodied, something that we kind of really feel and really grasp the meaning of and the significance of. And yeah, and so the terminology that I use, and like, yeah, a lot of people who have talked about the psychedelic experience and written about it have described this phenomenon. In the book, I'm just kind of connecting it to a particular bit of philosophical terminology, the idea of new knowledge of old facts. And so this is one of the answers that some materialist philosophers have given to the puzzle created by Mary's room, is they've said, well, look, there's actually just one fact here, right? The fact of what it's like to see red, and all the facts that Mary knows about the neurophysiological and computational events. They're not separate facts. It's just one fact, actually, but it's just known in different ways, or from under different guises, if you like. It's maybe akin to the difference between, you know, knowing that Clark Kent works for the Daily Planet and knowing that Superman works for the Daily Planet, or something like that. It's one objective state of affairs, but you can know it under different guises. And so that's what these philosophers say happens when Mary leaves the room, is she comes to know not a new fact that she didn't know before, but she comes to know an old fact that she already knew in a different way, under a new guise, or as they say, under a new mode of presentation. And so that's one way. I don't think it's the only way, but that's one way of analyzing and describing what's happening in these kinds of psychedelic cases. Is, yeah, you take a fact that you already knew, an old fact, and then somehow, because of the effects they have on cognitive processing, the drugs allow you to know that fact in a new way. And yeah, very often a way that is much richer and deeper and more kind of salient, as you say, and motivating.
And it seems to me to be a really kind of consequential rather than academic debate, because there's a lot of discussion around how much the experience or the phenomenology of psychedelic experiences is responsible for their therapeutic effects. And you might be aware that there are companies now, I think primarily in the US, actually this has already been done, I believe, but there are companies that are looking at creating essentially analogues, synthetic analogues of psychedelic substances that don't have the trippy effects. So I wonder, is that, I don't think it's something you discuss in the book, but it feels like that might pose an interesting question for the philosophy of psychedelics.
So I don't specifically discuss, actually, no, I do mention it briefly, people trying to create these analogues, but I definitely discuss this question of, is it the experience or not? And
Right.
I'm firmly in the camp of it's the experience that's doing most of the therapeutic work. But I should say most is important, right? Because what I think is probably going on is that, there is this evidence that psychedelics like psilocybin, if you kind of give psilocybin and so on to cultured neurons in a petri dish, they do seem to stimulate processes of neuroplasticity. They seem to stimulate the growth of dendritic spines and so on. So that suggests to me that they do have some direct effect on neuroplasticity, on the growth of synapses and so on, that is independent of the different types of experiences they induce. And so my suspicion is that that's actually contributing something to the therapeutic effects. So my kind of bet is that if you create a variant that has those same direct effects on neuroplasticity but doesn't have the trip, then it's going to be somewhat therapeutically effective, but not as therapeutically effective as the proper full-blown psychedelic version. Yeah.
And in the book, you do talk about ego dissolution to quite some length, but you also talk about the idea that you mentioned neuroplasticity there, but the idea that psychedelics can enable people to essentially retell the story of their own lives to themselves and the therapeutic utility that derives from that. And it seems to me that it's difficult to imagine how a psychedelic experience stripped of its effects could provide the same personal insights that would lead to those kinds of self-insight and transformation.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, I suspect if there are any therapeutic benefits, it'll end up being something more like the kinds of benefits that some people get from standard antidepressants like SSRIs. And, we don't fully know yet how SSRIs work, but there is evidence that they stimulate neuroplasticity at the molecular level through multiple pathways, and then they also seem to have effects on sort of emotional processing. And so one of the kind of theories going around at the moment is that this is part of how standard antidepressants work. When they do is they sort of enhance neuroplasticity and open up this window during which it's easier to change. But that sort of is supposed to explain why they don't work for everyone, because it's one thing to enhance neuroplasticity, but then you also need to rewire the networks in the right way, and the drug itself is not going to guarantee that. It's like it maybe has this biasing effect. It does sort of skew your information processing, your emotional processing in a bit more of a positive direction. And so perhaps in some cases, just the drug alone, especially if the person is in a good supportive environment, might lead to lasting alleviation of depressive symptoms. But then this would go to explain why you get better results from drugs and therapy in combination than from either on their own, and why, if people are kind of still in a bad environment, an environment that is contributing to their problems, the drugs themselves are not going to help that. It's all very well to make the system more plastic, more malleable, and skew it sort of a little bit in a more positive emotional direction. But if all the information coming in from outside is the same sort of information that might have contributed to the problem in the first place, then that's not going to get you anywhere. And so, I mean, I'm not actually a pharmacologist. Like I have kind of an amateur's knowledge of these sort of fields, but that's sort of my bet, is that if you get therapeutic mileage out of a tripless psychedelic, it's going to be something more like the sort of therapeutic mileage that some people, but not everyone, get out of standard antidepressants. Some sort of enhancement to neuroplasticity that really needs to be supplemented with some kind of therapy or supportive environment if it's actually going to lead to beneficial changes on a psychological level.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned SSRIs, and I think as well of, for example, electroshock therapy, and these are powerful psychological interventions, or in some cases powerful, and yet we know very little about why they may be effective. And I think a lot of people hearing you talk would question how much we can say with any definitiveness about psychedelics and the way that they work on the brain. So yeah, I guess how open are you to what neuroscience may tell us about psychedelics over the next, let's say 50 years. And, how does that affect, your view of psychedelics as a philosophical materialist?
Yeah, well, I would agree. I don't think we can say anything with much definitiveness, especially about what psychedelics do to the brain. I think in some ways our knowledge of their neural effects is less secure because there are so many kind of, as I say, variables involved and inferences involved there, and we're using all sorts of different neuroimaging techniques in different populations, and we're interpreting them in light of theoretical assumptions and so on. So in a sense, I think that our knowledge, even though it's still in its infancy and it's going to evolve, but our knowledge about what they do on an experiential level and on a psychological level is in a way more secure than our knowledge about what they do to the brain. I fully expect our understanding of what they do to the brain to evolve and change quite a lot. I mean, what I've tried to do in my book is sort of sketch a cohesive overall model that seems plausible in light of the best current evidence we've got, and that hopefully leads to some predictions that can be tested and can contribute to the overall ongoing effort to, research effort to find out what's really going on. But, I guess, so you said at the end, as a materialist, I'm not sure if you were sort of asking there, were you getting at, am I open to kind of new discoveries that might challenge a materialist take on psychedelics? Was that the idea? Yeah. Oh, well, look, I'm always open to it. I'm not expecting it, but if we get the evidence, we get the evidence. That's basically my position.
Yeah. Well, that's great. We might leave it there, Chris, but that's been a fascinating conversation, and it's I should say that it is a highly coherent and plausible sounding analysis, philosophy of psychedelics, by Chris Letheby, Oxford University Press. Thanks again for chatting, Chris. It's been really great.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ben.
Created on the land of the Kaurna people. Technical production by Edwin Kemp Attrell. Supported by Replay Creative. Music by Lazy Susan.